I'll give it just a moment for people to log in. Okay, I'll go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barrett Stratford. I am the Director of External Relations for BIO. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon and thank those of you who joined us last week for our first session of BIO's mini semester focusing on the science of cell and gene therapies. Last week, we heard from Anju Chwala from Bluebird Bio and Peter Emtaj of Kite, and they provided a fantastic overview of the science behind these innovative treatments. Today, during today's session, we will learn about how we will pay for cell and gene therapies. Just a few housekeeping items. As a reminder, these sessions are being recorded and they will be available in the future on BIO's website, probably just a few weeks. Also, I will send a survey following our session and I'd love to get everyone's feedback. So look for that email from me later this afternoon. So with that, I would like to hand it over to our moderator for today, Jennifer Bright. She's the Executive Director of the Innovation and Value Initiative. Jennifer has over 2 decades of healthcare policy, issue management, patient advocacy, and executive leadership experience. She served as the Executive Director for the Society of Healthcare Epidemiology of America, as well as the National Mental Health Association, which is now Mental Health America, where she focused on advancing policy initiatives at the state and local level. So with that, Jennifer, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Barrett. Good afternoon, everybody. I am really pleased to be part of this session today, and I have a very small but important role, and that is to keep us on time and to introduce our fantastic set of panelists today, and then to hopefully guide some interesting and not combative conversation about payment. So I wanted to start by just saying a couple of things. Mostly about the carry forward from the first session in this mini semester, which was about the science. And there were several points that were brought up by the previous speakers that Barrett mentioned that I thought were particularly relevant to today's conversation, and which I hope our speakers will not only mention in their initial remarks, but also can come through in our Q&A. So, you know, at IVI, we work in innovating in the area of methods for how we incorporate patient perspectives and approach HTA for novel therapies like cell and gene therapies using newer methods in health economics research. And a lot of that has to do with understanding the data, understanding the perspectives of all stakeholders, but especially patients, and then thinking about how do we use that information to guide thinking about payment strategy. And really the payment aspects, novel approaches to payment aspects are what we are going to be hearing about today, which will be terrific. But some of the key takeaways from the science session last week include the fact that there is enormous data uncertainty, especially in this area. And that is a key constraint to really understanding the therapeutic value and for whom from a predictive standpoint. And I think that that's something we need to grapple with when we think about payment models. So I'm looking forward to hearing our speakers' perspectives on that. I think another area that I heard discussed in the Q&A was really about how payment needs to foster or stimulate use, which will promote learning. So if you think about this as a continuous quality improvement, continuous learning cycle, that payment has a role not just in ensuring access, but also in stimulating the real world knowledge base that we all need in order to understand for whom these therapies are most valuable. We also heard that patient preferences are incredibly important to understanding value, particularly in an area like cell and gene therapies, which is really the epitome of personalized medicine. And how does, so the question then becomes, how does payment feasibly account for that, for things like patient preferences? How do we adapt patient models to accommodate differences in patient values, for example? And then lastly, a key theme was that the novel aspects of value are really relevant in this space. Outcomes are very different. And when we talk about, healthy versus a non-sick state, lifetime without disease, for example, as being achievable goals with cell and gene therapy, then how we accommodate that in our understanding of value and how we pay for it has to grapple with this kind of, off event horizon thinking that we have now before us. So I wanted to start off by carrying forward those themes and then challenge my speakers to kind of address them in your initial remarks, which I know you will, and then I'm looking forward to a great conversation after each person's individual remarks. So we're going to hear from three folks today. First is Vadim Lubarsky, who's the Executive Director for CMS Policy and Reimbursement at Novartis. And Vadim has likewise had a couple of decades of experience in healthcare policy broadly, both in industry as well as over 10 years at CMS. So I know he brings an important perspective from both the payer and the industry side. Next, we're going to hear from Mark Trusheim, who is the Strategic Director for New Digs at MIT. And he has also had enormous amount of experience in everything from big data to molecular diagnostics. So I think he can take us from the smallest element to the big picture thinking quite readily. And then last but never least, Megan Gutierrez, who is the CEO of the Lymphoma Research Foundation, which is, I didn't know this, the nation's largest nonprofit organization devoted to funding lymphoma research and education. It was pleasing to me to find out that she is also a fellow mental health advocate in her past career. And also interestingly was part of an effort to develop the very first mobile app for patients living with lymphoma. So I think she definitely can speak to the practical aspects of how patient advocacy and patient needs have evolved with the genesis of cell and gene therapies, and what that means from the standpoint of advocating for alternative approaches to payment. So with that, my job is done for at least the time being, and I'm going to hand it over to Vadim.
Hi, so great to thank you so much. So great to be here. I'm going to start by thanking this group, because I do a lot of these panels, and my absolute favorite ones to do are the ones focused on patient advocates, because you do so much for patients, and you're oftentimes with them when they need someone the most, and it is an incredibly important role. So thank you so much for having me. So I'm Vadim Lubarsky. I lead the CMS engagement policy work for Novartis, and I think most folks probably know Novartis, but just in case, we are a global diversified healthcare company, obviously focused on innovative medicines, both branded pharmaceuticals and biosimilars and high quality generics through our Sandoz division. And I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that in the last couple of years, certainly, we brought some really interesting products to market. And since this is a cell and gene panel, I'll spend my time talking about our cell and gene focus. So if we can go to the next slide. Can we go to the next slide?
I think we may have a slight delay, Vadim, but I will.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so I was just going to start talking, and so the slide came up. But as we talk about this, I think what we always need to remember is that, as you know, interesting and revolutionary some of these products are, at the end of each of these products is a patient, and we have two here. Both were treated with CART. For folks that don't know, CARTs are chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapies. The way they work is they re-engineer T cells to attack cancer cells, so they turn the body's immune system into cancer fighters. It's pretty interesting stuff. And our specific CART was approved for PZAOL, primarily a pediatric indication, in August of 2017, and then DLBCL, which is a large B cell lymphoma, in May of 2018. And we have two patients on the side, and I should thank our Alliance Development and Advocacy person, Alicia Subasinghe, who I think most folks probably know, who helped pull these slides together, because you look at these slides, and the patient on the left was treated for DLBCL. Obviously, the statement speaks for itself, given 3 to 6 months to live, and after treatment lived significantly longer. And the patient on the right, Emily Whitehead, who was one of the first patients, I believe actually the first patient treated under the with CART, is one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard. My disclaimer is I haven't met either one of these patients, but I've heard them speak. And the story is that they were out of options. She was treated. She spiked a huge fever, which we now know is a result of the cytokine storm. And the doctors didn't think she'd make it through the night. And then the next morning, they checked on her, and it was a completely different story. And here we are years and years later, and she's essentially living a normal life. So amazing stories. And when you hear these stories, you realize that the products are pretty revolutionary, but it's the fact that we do see improved outcomes, but it's also the fact that they give these patients hope that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have had. So so it's pretty incredible. And if we can go to the next slide. And then the other disease area I want to talk about is spinal muscular atrophy. So Novartis has the second approved gene by the FDA specific to spinal muscular atrophy for patients 2 and under. And for folks that might not know, spinal muscular atrophy is an absolutely debilitating disease that attacks the motor neurons in a person's body, resulting in trouble standing, walking, breathing, and the most severe form of the disease is in infants who either don't live past the age of 2 or on permanent ventilation. So it is an absolutely horrible disease. And meet Matteo. So I used to say Matteo was in kindergarten. I guess he's probably in 1st or 2nd grade now. But his mother was identified as potentially being a carrier for the SMA type 1 defective gene. She received genetic testing, and then when Matteo was born, he was accepted into a clinical trial and treated at 27 days. And the 27 days is especially important, and I'll get to that in a second. But here we are years later, and he's living a very different life than he would have otherwise. And it's because he was treated, but it's also because he was treated early. So when we talk about access to these products, it's oftentimes access, but it's oftentimes early access to actually make a difference. So that's SMA. If we could go to the next slide. So we've talked about obviously the innovation itself, but let's talk about some of the challenges. So cell and gene therapies obviously face a whole slew of challenges. I've listed a couple of them there, and the most important ones to talk about are actually the ones that aren't on here. It's the challenge of developing these products, developing the clinical trials, which are often small and narrow populations, so it's hard to actually find the patients for these trials. And then the FDA review process, it's hard being first. A lot of times these products are first, and then once you actually have an approved product, then you get into a whole slew of other issues, everything from long-term product outcomes to reimbursement to budget impact, and obviously patient access and affordability. If we could go to the next slide. So what we spend a lot of time at Novartis is thinking about ways to improve access to these products. So for our cart, we launched, and I should say that some of the ways to do that is through value-based arrangements. And for our cart, we launched with an arrangement that states that if there isn't a complete remission for the pediatric AOL indication, if there isn't a complete remission in the first 30 days of treatment, then there's no charge to the broader healthcare system. So think about how revolutionary that is. And then for the SMA treatment, we launched with both an outcomes-based rebate and a pay over time option. And for the outcomes-based rebate, it phases in over 5 years, and if in the first year the outcome measure isn't met, then there's a full 100% rebate, and then it obviously phases out at 20% over 5 years. And that's one of the ways that Novartis has tried to stand behind our products and to put our money where our mouth is. If we go to the next slide. But none of this comes without challenges. So remember, the current payment systems were developed years before anyone even thought about VBAs. They were, the foundational Medicare statute was written in 1965, and at that point, it was a pure fee-for-service system, right? The payment systems were designed to process claims quickly, to pay the claim, and then to move on to the next claim. There were no VBAs. So now we're operating in a world where, certain manufacturers, certain providers want to stand behind their products and services, and it's hard to do because there are barriers in place that were put in place for all the right reasons, but now make it hard to provide these types of VBAs. And I've listed a couple of them here. The ones we talk about most are price reporting barriers like best price and ASP, and then obviously the anti-kickback statute as well. So a lot of what we think about at Novartis is how to, remove these barriers or work around these barriers, obviously, as appropriate, so that we can stand behind our products. And I know Mark is going to talk about this a little bit, but I want to give a specific shout out to CMS, which is the federal agency that obviously oversees both the Medicare and Medicaid programs, for issuing a regulation about 2 months ago that proposed to remove at least one of these barriers, best price, in a way that would make it a lot simpler to provide some of these VBAs and develop some of these VBAs. So they should get a lot of credit, and we obviously commented on that regulation. And if folks haven't looked at it, you should, because it is incredibly important. If we could go to the next slide. So if you think that the current healthcare system doesn't know what to do with VBAs, then it really doesn't know what to do with what we're talking about today, potentially curative one-time therapies. So when we think about patient access, and I know all of us are always thinking about that, we need to be thinking about how to modernize current payment systems in a way that recognizes the value of these products. So it means, and I put up kind of the 3 pillars, which are coding, coverage, and payment. So we need to be thinking about codes that effectively recognize the technology and allow insurers to quickly pay the claims. We need to think about coverage decisions that are actually incentives to providing these products and services rather than hindrances. And we obviously need to think about payment mechanisms that recognize the value of these products. And again, CMS should get another shout out because on CART specifically, they had proposed a permanent payment rate in the form of a diagnostic related group that would phase out the new technology add-on payment for CARTs and put in place a more permanent and a more consistent code that would allow for, I think would provide providers a lot of faith and a lot of consistency in providing these therapies. So incredibly important on their part, and we have our fingers crossed that it'll be finalized as proposed, and hopefully we'll see that regulation come out soon. But when we think about how to modernize our payment systems, I think foremost we need to be thinking about obviously these 3 pillars, but also the fact that these potentially curative one-time therapies could provide significant savings on the back end. So as we look at the cost, we need to be thinking what happens if this patient doesn't need a lifetime of care? What happens if they don't need a lifetime of inpatient, outpatient care? What happens if we can treat them more effectively, more efficiently? And improve their lives at the same time. So we give a lot of thought to that as well. So let's go to the next slide. So why is this important? So the cell and gene therapy market is obviously growing, but if you look at those numbers, 1,000 currently active US registered clinical trials for cell and gene therapy, 50 additional FDA clinical reviewers assigned to the cell and gene therapy group, and then about 50 expected FDA approvals for cell and gene therapies by 2025. So we're seeing more of these therapies come to market. And if we can't find a way to pay for them and recognize their value, then I think all of us suffer as a result, and society suffers as a result. And remember that some of these therapies, we talk a lot about how cell and gene therapies could potentially, break the US healthcare bank. A lot of these therapies are designed for small, narrow populations, sometimes 50, 100, 150, 200 patients, sometimes more, but sometimes not. And that makes it even harder because each one is almost looked at as a kind of a separate entity. And we need to be thinking about it more holistically so that we can find the right approach to make sure that this innovation continues. So I'm going to stop there, and I think I'm turning it over to Mark.
Thanks, Vadim.
Yeah.
Mark, welcome.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. And if the slide master could bring up my slides, otherwise I'll just talk. And I'm an academic, so that could take a long time. So really happy to be with you all here today. Thanks again to Bio and Jennifer, to you for moderating all of this. I'm Mark Trusheim from MIT NEWDIGS, which stands for New Drug Development Paradigms at the Center for Biomedical Innovation. And we're going to go through some of our work at our project called FOCUS, Financing of Cures in the US. Next slide, please. So we work at MIT NEWDIGS to ensure that patients actually benefit from all the upstream scientific breakthroughs by we help to catalyze the downstream breakthroughs that are also needed to match those scientific breakthroughs so that patients really get the final product at the end of the day. Too often we've seen numerous challenges both in the regulatory settings with regulators have gotten much better over the past decade, and increasingly now we're seeing payer and sometimes even provider impediments to patients gaining access to these therapies. So we're a broad stakeholder consortium that we address the financial challenges after the price or the value has been set. So many different groups have multiple frameworks for what is the appropriate pricing. And we agree that that's incredibly important. We had some rare humility at MIT to think that maybe there were other people that had brilliant ideas in that area, and we'd be better off working in a different segment. And what we found all of our stakeholders agreed is no matter how those price negotiations play out, these are going to be expensive therapies just because of their nature of a single upfront value event of that one-time therapy, which then causes all kinds of pricing challenges or payment challenges rather after that. Unfortunately, just to preview what you're going to see, we found that there's no single financial approach that fits all the products for all the payer types, much less address all the patient financial impediments of out-of-pocket costs, travel to centers of excellence, and other sorts of challenges that might be latent in some of these, which I'll explain in a couple of moments. And so we talk about a financial precision financing toolkit. And Vadim was nice enough on a prior slide to give a shout out to some of our work. If you go to payingforcures.org, you'll find a number of those. Next slide, and we'll get right into some of the issues, some of which have already been discussed. But to make a really fine point on it, by 2031, we expect 65, 75 new products to be launched in the United States. And that's coming from what we think are about 750 different programs. Many programs have multiple clinical trials. That's why Vadim had a number that was slightly larger than the number that you see on this slide, but it's that same pipeline. But out of that, as you know, not everything is guaranteed to succeed. It's one of the great challenges that Vadim mentioned about drug development. It's highly risky still, even in this category. But beyond those upfront costs, at the beginning, we're seeing multiple years of benefit. And that's on the right-hand side of the top of this, trying to show that difference. It's sort of like, instead of paying rent for the apartment, with these new therapies, we're buying the condo, right? We're paying for it up front, and then we get benefits from a great life living with that result, that benefit for many years. Unfortunately, healthcare never had a sense of a mortgage to help with all these things. So this upfront payment is a real challenge. However, as you've also heard today, it's not just that upfront payment. It's also these performance risks, this effectiveness and durability uncertainty that Jennifer mentioned at the very beginning. We're not confident yet that this works for a lifetime, for 10 years, for 5 years. We're not sure it works for everyone because of the regulatory flexibility, we haven't run 1,000 patient trials for any of these, oftentimes because that's more patients than have the condition in the first place. So our trials are smaller. So there's more uncertainty about whether it will truly, these therapies will work for absolutely everyone through all this. And that also then adds to this actuarial risk for payers. As you heard Vadim mention, will they have a couple patients or 5 patients or 10? And when these therapies are reasonably expensive, that can be a major effect for a payer. Next slide, if you would. So you heard me mention that there's no perfect solution. We didn't expect to have 5 of these when we started, but that's where we've sort of wound up. We have short-term milestone contracts. We have a warranty model, which as you might expect, it means it sort of pays people back if it doesn't work, but not off the price, but off of the other expenses that people might incur through the product not working. We have these multi-year performance annuities that combine a little bit of an installment plan, sort of a mortgage, but also this performance characteristic that if it stops working, you can stop paying over time through this. We have a carve-out or a risk pool approach, which we call an orphan reinsurer and benefit manager. And then there's a subscription model, which some of you may be familiar with, that was used in the hepatitis C space in the states of Louisiana and Washington, where they paid a fixed amount for basically unlimited access to the therapies that they needed over time. What is both helpful but still discouraging is you notice all the circles in this slide. No one solution is solid blue circles all the way across, meaning that no one of these solutions yet perfectly addresses all of the aspects of the payment timing, the performance risk, and the actuarial risk. So it's still a little bit of what's most important to particular situations. And we're also finding that while milestone-based contracts, as Vadim indicated, have been really used to great effect in the CAR-T space, many of the other solutions are just barely beginning to roll out and face a number of these regulatory challenges as well. Patient out-of-pocket costs are crucially important, and that sort of covers this entire space. Insurance designs at some points do cover the travel and some of the out-of-pocket costs for taking your child or family member to a facility farther away from your home, but many don't. And I just lost my screen. I apologize for why I switched cameras. So I'm not sure how to fix that. So I'm going to just turn off my camera if I can, or maybe someone else can do that. There we go. So moving forward to the next slide, if you would, please. There's a couple of examples of these performance-based annuities, one by Bluebird Bio for their Zynteglo product, which treats beta thalassemia, has been approved in Europe. We hope it will be approved this year by FDA. It's under review, and they should have a decision in 2020. And they have this spread the payments over up to 5 years, where only the first payment is guaranteed to Bluebird Bio, and the rest come over time. Next slide, please. Cigna has one of these sort of subscription or orphan reinsurer benefit manager approaches where a payer pays a single amount for as much product as they need in at least 2 and now increasingly more products as they come forward. So these are beginning to show up in the world, but they're still not everywhere. And if you take a look at the next slide, we did a survey in 2019 where we asked a number of payers what approach did you think was going to be most important to them. And out of 153 payers, you see most of them liked things that were shorter term, because many of the longer term approaches were still facing problems and hurdles. Here's again where I really, as Vadim did, want to give a shout out to CMS. They have a proposed rule on Medicaid best price that will really make particularly the performance-based annuity and those long-term milestone contracts and installment plans really much more feasible to come to for payers, developers, and patient and provider groups all to participate in. So we hope that becomes final and we'll move forward. But in addition to that, as you'll see on the next slide, beyond this Medicaid best price issues, we have some risk-sharing challenges. Which providers are going to be in these center of excellence networks? That's a real challenge for patient access. If there's only 20 centers in the country, that can be really difficult for many patients just practically to gain access to it. This interaction with reinsurance and stop-loss insurance can mean that if you're employed by an employer who doesn't have that kind of coverage, the employer may have the ability simply to write out coverage for these products. That's another real challenge that we need to, as a society and as individual companies, overcome. Then there's some legal issues. We've heard Medicaid best price reporting, and that's the challenge if you're not familiar with it, that commercial plans have to report and developers have to report all their sales on the commercial side so that Medicaid, the government program for the poor, gets the best price. But the way those mechanics are set up, it can actually wind up that if you share risk and give a huge discount for a patient who doesn't perform well, that huge discount could set the national price for all Medicaid patients, even for those Medicaid patients that do really well. So that's a challenge there, and that's again where CMS has a new proposed rule that we hope will solve that. The FDA can sometimes still be a challenge because some of those endpoints that we'd love to use for patients and even payers would like to see more functional status sorts of things. If they weren't in the original clinical trial, that could be off-label promotion and the developers could go to jail for using those kind of metrics. So that's a bit of a challenge yet. And then trying to track all these outcomes can be burdensome. Next slide, if you would, which is I think the last one, which is that these precision financing solutions have to fit the situation. We need a toolkit of these various approaches. You'll see here that for most of the segments, we have a pretty good match to all of these things, but not for all. And we're still working on it and look forward to all of you as well participating. Again, come to payingforcures.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mark. And finally, we'll hear from Megan.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to Bio for the invitation to present on today's panel. While my slides get pulled up, I'll just say that I think that part of my invitation to speak today stems from the fact that lymphoma is among the first disease states to witness an FDA approval for a cell therapy for a treatment of any serious disease. So our experience in advocating for patient access to these therapies may be relevant to numerous communities in which cell and gene therapies are currently being studied. And so today, when my slides come up, you can see I've taken a little bit of a case study approach to share some of what our community focused on patients with lymphoma has taken on with regard to approval, access, coverage, and reimbursement challenges. And some of the tools from our armamentarium, which we've used as patient advocates to really advocate on behalf of those patients whose lives are literally dependent upon access to some of these therapies. If you could advance to the second slide, I actually begin with a little bit of an overview of the disease state itself. The heterogeneity of the lymphomas also may make the disease a unique case study, as there are actually more than 100 different subtypes of the disease. So on slide 2, you'll see just an example of the subtypes with the highest prevalence rates, inclusive of both indolent and highly aggressive disease, as well as some subtypes with numerous treatment options, and others where the standard of care remains a clinical trial. Next slide after that, we'll catch up eventually. For the purposes of our discussion today, I'm going to be focusing much of my presentation on diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, or DLBCL. It's a common and aggressive lymphoma subtype, which was among the first treated with a CAR T-cell therapy. And as you'll see on this, the following slide, I've outlined a couple of characteristics specific to this disease state. But one of the bullet points, I think, is that roughly half of the patients diagnosed with this disease are over age 60, which makes some of our conversations today about the Medicare program highly relevant. On the following slide after that, which I think continues to share a little bit more about the typical trajectory of a patient with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, we'll see that it requires immediate treatment. And you can see that the patients with this disease, it's really important to highlight what their limited disease options are, particularly in the relapsed and refractory setting. It's important, this level of context, that we repeatedly found ourselves at LRF sharing with policymakers, as it is the patient experience that informs concepts around access, benefit, and value. Next slide. There's a blood literature review, which was published in 2016, that assessed the different prognostic factors for these patients. And again, I bring this up because it's important to understand the prognosis for patients with relapsed and refractory disease is quite poor, with the median survival of less than 1 year. And less than half of those patients who relapse are still alive 1 year after that relapse. It's important to understand how quickly as well the treatment decision-making must occur. And so when we think about patient access, it's not literal access to the therapies themselves, but it's also obviously the time in which it can take a patient once that treatment decision's been made to access a potentially life-saving therapy. And again here, and you can go to the next slide, you can see that age was seen also, continues to be an important indicator in DLBCL patients who relapse with poor prognosis, as you can see here for patients over the age of 65. You can go to the next slide, please. So these data that I've just shared illustrate the urgent need identified in this patient population, and that it propelled rightfully investment and interest in the 2 CAR T therapies that were ultimately approved for the treatment of this type of lymphoma. The approvals of Axi-cel and Tisa-cel mark the first T-cell products to be approved by the FDA for the treatment of an adult cancer, making our experience in coverage and reimbursement relevant to the advocacy community, as there are hundreds, or we heard from Vadim, in fact, more than 1,000 cell and gene therapies currently being studied across numerous disease states. Next slide, please. Toward that end, and relevant to the topic of value, I've highlighted here the shift that the advent of CAR T-cell therapies really represented in our community and amongst this patient population. So for the first time, it raised the possibility of eradication of relapsed or refractory disease, and a possible replacement for the first time ever for transplant. We also continue to see the study and wider application to an even more broad spectrum of B-cell malignancies. Patient education and treatment sequencing also were really revolutionized around this approval. They became pivotal issues for patients and for patient advocates as we began to articulate the need for greater access. And so toward that end, I've just kind of highlighted here, I think, something that resonates with numerous other patient advocacy groups, and that's the overall impact of some of these approvals on the patient population. If you can go to the next slide, you'll see an example of just a couple of new materials that the Lymphoma Research Foundation either were required to update dramatically or to create new wholesale to develop for patients. This provided information not only on the new treatment modalities themselves, but specific information related to coverage and access of these therapies. And for the first time, it was our foundation's really responsibility to think about creating education materials that married scientific information, medical data, as well as information on coverage and reimbursement, because we knew it was going to be incredibly important for patients to understand the new paradigm that was represented by these therapies. You can go to the next slide, please. So amidst the transition, now that we've kind of covered the approval, that this transition that was taking place in the clinic as the community began to understand how and when to use these therapies, questions surrounding coverage of CAR T-cell therapy began to emerge. And in early 2018, so roughly a year after the initial approvals, United Healthcare requested a national coverage analysis determination. Now, in the absence of a national coverage policy, an item or a service can be covered at the discretion of Medicare contractors based on local coverage determination, something that could be problematic, certainly for our patients, but for any incredibly ill patient population, as well as for an emergency and complex treatment option like CAR T, which wasn't yet available in every medical center across the country. And for those unfamiliar with the process, NCDs are made through an evidence-based process. I've attempted to outline them here. It's obviously pretty complex, but they include opportunities for public comments and participation, and is overseen by CMS. In some cases, CMS's own research is supplemented by an outside technology assessment or consultation with other experts through a MedCAC meeting. This is the Medicare Evidence Development and Coverage Advisory Committee, for those of you unfamiliar with the process or the body. Now, once this is completed, CMS reviews the collective evidence and commentary and develops a draft decision which undergoes an additional comment period before being finalized. And in both cases, both comments periods, as well as, I recall, a pretty interesting MedCAC meeting, provided an opportunity for advocacy groups like LRF and others to speak to the impact that these therapies could have on people with lymphoma. We found ourselves presenting some of the data that I actually shared at the top of this presentation and using some of the patient-facing materials we had created to demonstrate the urgency with which patients facing life-threatening illness might require treatment, as well as the need for clear coverage policies that protected appropriate patient access to CAR T-cell therapy. We articulated at that time that this could be accomplished by an update to the policy that also ensured consistency and adherence to product labeling and protecting against any delays in coverage, since the timing can be so critical for these patients. We also at that time actually utilized information from the FDA itself, knowing that upon its approval, the first CAR T therapy, the FDA itself noted that the treatment marked a milestone in the treatment of cancer, and actually mentioned that gene and cell therapy had gone from being a promising concept to a practical solution for deadly and largely untreatable forms of cancer. Ultimately, in this case, CMS approved CAR T-cell therapies for Medicare beneficiaries nationwide. Another byproduct of this lengthy national coverage discussion was considerable attention paid to the relationship between coverage and reimbursement, delineating between the two, which I think was incredibly important for the patient advocacy community to recognize, including several novel payment and value frameworks, which have already been highlighted this afternoon. If you could go to the next slide, please. These conversations in turn shed light on the economic impact, rather, of cancer care and novel cancer therapies like cell therapies, and the impact they had, particularly on people with lymphoma. And here you can see some of the arguments that we articulated to really think about the full effect on patients. If you'll go to the next slide, you can also see, here a few additional points that highlight patients' exposure to out-of-pocket and other ancillary expenses that can accompany the utilization of complex therapies like CAR T therapy, and how those are really compounded, if you think about it, when one considers that financial concerns that many providers and institutions articulate related to reimbursement for the administration of these CAR T-cell therapies. And we really felt that it was our position and really our responsibility to highlight some of these extraneous costs that we know could prohibit patient access as well, because it's wholly important for all stakeholders to recognize these unmet needs and the economic burden of patients when thinking about value-based and other payment solutions to ensure access. If you go to the next slide, continuing on these themes of reimbursement, I've outlined here the specific challenges we've sought to address with regard to reimbursement today, viewed through the lens of patient access. Because of uncertainties about payment and reimbursement, fewer institutions were providing CAR T-cell treatments outside of clinical trials, or they were at least sharing and stating with us that they might limit access to the extent that they could provide treatment to people with lymphoma outside of a clinical trial setting. And as a result, patients who weren't immune to hearing pieces of this dialogue, they really felt that some patients who might benefit from these therapies might not be receiving them, either because of a real lack of access or a perceived lack of access to these therapies at different institutions. If you go to the next slide, I can chat a little bit more today what CMS is proposing to ameliorate some of these challenges. They're proposing some important changes to how hospitals in the inpatient setting would be reimbursed under the Medicare program. As the agency sought feedback, we utilized our scientific advisors, some of the data points we've presented here today, as well as drawing upon the experience of patients themselves who were contacting our helpline and using some of these new cell therapy specific resources regarding these therapies. So in the current fiscal year IPPS proposed rule, CMS is proposing to create a new MSDRG, as many of us had advocated for CAR T treatments. with differential reimbursements based on whether the product was provided as a part of a clinical trial, which was also an important distinction that many of us have made throughout the comment period. This policy would change the increase or the degree to which these payments are predictable, which also has long been an issue when we've talked about alternative and unique payment methods, something that many institutions have articulated are going to be important if they're continuing to offer these therapies and are able to do so to an even more broad patient population. We too feel that the agency should be commended for accepting the input from a wide cross-section of stakeholder groups, including patients and patient advocates, as they came to this decision, which I think is important to note really did establish a precedent for how CMS may approach other cell and gene therapies in the future. Stakeholders, I think, are now considering how this decision, as well as new payment proposals, could have an impact in other payer markets, which I think will probably come into play during our discussion after our presentations today. If you go to my next slide, I just hope that our experience as we think about this new proposed rule and the impact that it might have is, I think, going to be an important piece of learning across the patient advocacy community. And if you'll go to the next slide, perfect. I hope that by using our experience as a bit of a case study, we've been able to help illustrate the impact coverage and reimbursement directly have on patient access and the importance of exploring new coverage and payment policies that can help protect patient access and demonstrate a certain degree of flexibility as our understanding of these treatments and the scientific landscape continues to evolve, which I think will be critically important. What's more, patient advocates and advocacy organizations have an important role to play here with their ability to offer unique resources directly to patients themselves and to represent the patient experience and the impact of these potentially transformative therapies. So I think with that, I will draw the presentation to a close and I will look forward to the panel discussion.
Megan, thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists. And Mark, welcome back. We can see you instead of your awesome fan. So,
good. Please.
Great. We have a few questions coming in, but I'm going to remind everybody who's on the phone to just ping us with your questions. We want to make effective use of our remaining time. And while we're allowing people to germinate on questions that they want to present, I have one to, I think, probably pose to Megan and Mark in first, and then Vadim, if you have thoughts to weigh in as well. Megan, you ended by saying there's a really important role for patient advocates. And one of the things I was thinking about during Mark's presentation was that patients are often not in the room where it happens, right? And when we think about all these novel approaches to payment structures, what is, Megan, what is your recommendation to patient organizations about how to get started, how to not force your way into the room, but insert yourself? And that's one aspect. And the other is, what's the most important information that a patient organization really should point to try to bring that perspective forward into the conversations about payment?
So I think anyone who knows me knows that I would say I have no problem with forcing myself or the patient perspective in any room, but it was nice of you to say that. I think, first of all, the patient advocacy organizations need to know and be reminded, as do all stakeholder groups, that they have an incredibly important perspective to share and certain insights that I don't know any other stakeholder group can really replicate. So I would say recognizing and valuing the perspective of patient advocacy organizations and the patients themselves in some instances is critically important. I also think that patient advocacy organization involvement also needs to occur long before the discussion of new payment models or access models are even considered. I think when patient advocates are brought in, even integrated as early in the process as clinical trial and protocol design, as an example, they can bring to bear their very rich experiences thinking about the express specific needs of a given patient population, as well as some of the access barriers that may already exist within the community. When that, coupled with the identification of significant unmet therapeutic or clinical need, can be married with that perspective, I think you can then ensure that some of these treatments are already meeting some of the hurdles that may exist within the community. And then you have a very rich patient, community, and stakeholder group relationship that then, once a new treatment comes to market, can continue a dialogue that's already been ongoing. So you can really make certain that the patients that really do have that demonstrable greatest need are being met and have been considered as a part of the process and the objective or goal of developing a new treatment from the very beginning.
Mark, any thoughts based on your your ecology of multi-stakeholder? What is it that, how often are patients involved in the conversations that you're having within your project, and what is it that they're bringing to the table that has the most impact?
Well, all the things that Megan said, obviously. Just being present and being invited in, and when not invited, asking to be invited into the process, I think is important, as Megan said, from the development stage forward, because these conversations about how to provide access really begin already in the clinical trial phase, as they pick what are the outcomes metrics. And if those outcomes metrics aren't really aligned with what patients value, it's both not the greatest regulatory decisions might be made then, but also then using those metrics for outcomes and other sorts of payment approaches like we've just talked about becomes really difficult. So coming right into that, I think, is important. And also, patients have a viewpoint that, as you even heard today, these conversations collapse too much to what's a drug developer and a payer going to do. And there's large issues of benefit design around out-of-pocket costs. How do I get to the center of excellence? How do you cover my lost income when I'm traveling and have to take my child there? If you do a multi-year payment approach, you're going to have to ensure that patients don't somehow get triggered with a deductible in each one of those future years, which none of the payers say that they want to have happen. But I've heard every payer state that they have concerns that their computer systems just work a certain way and they still live in fear of an accidental billing happening through all this. So really making sure that patients are engaged in not just the principles, but the mechanics of how this is going to work with those payers, I think, is incredibly important, whether through large multi-stakeholder groups or really quite good advocacy within your states and with your state insurance regulators, et cetera, to make sure that these things are upheld. Finally, with Medicaid, Medicaid is supposed to pay for your out-of-pocket costs if you have to travel, particularly out of state. Medicaid programs are not always good about carrying through on those legal obligations and often need a patient advocacy group to really step up on behalf of individual patients to ensure that they receive the benefits to which the law entitles them.
Great.
It's Vadim. Can I jump in real quick with just one thought?
Absolutely, Vadim.
Because I wanna recognize something that Megan talked about in her opening remarks, which was the coverage decision. And I just want to remind everyone, and CMS should absolutely be commended for the place we got to, which was an open NCD. But remember, we didn't start there. We started with a proposal for coverage with evidence development. And I would argue that the reason we got to a really good place is because everyone came together, not just manufacturers, not just providers, and especially patients and patient advocates, and said, you're setting an incredibly important precedent here, and these products are important and they make a difference and they need to be covered. And I would argue that that is one of the primary reasons we got to a really good place. So when we think about patients and patient advocates and why they're important, that's why they're important. The voice matters. It certainly mattered there, and it'll matter in a lot of other policies going forward. So keep speaking up because it's incredibly important.
That's a great point, Vadim. Thank you for sharing that. We are running low on time, so I'm going to pick one of the questions from the audience. And this question, I would say, either Mark or Vadim could start off, perhaps Mark and then Vadim. Where have payers been the most and or least enthusiastic in looking at alternative payment models? Where does the trending seem to be going in your view? You had that beautifully elegant slide about the circles with the different uptake, but where do payers seem to be most easily swayed to proceed, and where do they have the most trepidation? Mark, perhaps let's start with you, and Vadim, you can weigh in based on Novartis's experience.
So they have the most excitement for multi-year performance-based annuities or other kinds of multi-year mechanisms for manufacturers and developers to stand behind their products. However, for implementation reasons, they actually gravitate towards very short-term, sort of one-year milestone contracts that are just a lot easier to implement in today's world, right? So they have this desire to do some very creative things, but the complexities of day-to-day administration and metrics really force them back to pretty short-term sorts of arrangements for a whole variety of reasons. But Vadim, you've been having more success in some of those bolder things, so I'll defer to you.
Well, so I'm going to take a slightly different tack than you did, Mark, and say that our healthcare system as a whole is really, really bad at dealing with the unknown. And we're especially bad at dealing with firsts. And it's not right. I mean, you kind of expect it. It's a huge, kind of juggernaut of a machine, and it's hard to see the forest through the trees. So this is when it really becomes important to see leadership. And we've seen some leadership from CMS recently in the form of this Medicaid NPRM and the proposed changes to best price. And we've seen leadership in also the proposal on bundled sales from CMS. And we've seen leadership in, starting to take small bites out of, these payment coding and coverage changes, challenges to these potentially curative one-time therapies. And that's where it's really hard, right? Because without leadership, everyone's going to default to, we've never done this before and it's too hard and we don't understand, these outcomes, and we don't understand how, we operationalize these value-based arrangements, and we just don't understand how to do it. So we'll just keep paying on a fee-for-service based system and we don't go anywhere. And with that leadership, we start to move in the right direction. So that's kind of my plea to all the folks listening to this call, which is, encourage that leadership and support it, because it's the only way we're going to get to a better place.
Great points, Vadim.
Unfortunately, we're at the top of the hour, but I am going to let Megan have the last word before I hand it over to Barrett. And just to say, if you had anything to add to what Vadim or Mark just said in terms of where, from a patient perspective, what looks the most promising to you? And I would just urge you to keep it to 20 seconds or less.
Sure. I'll just say in the last several years, I've met several patients whose lives have been saved and extended by these therapies. And I think that should remain all of our motivation, regardless of the paradigm or the particular plan. And I think if we can keep focused there, we can find meaningful success.
Well stated. Well, we could spend days talking about this. It's been my pleasure to host all of these wonderful speakers. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your passion. And I'm going to hand it back to Barrett to close us out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to each of our panelists for joining us today. We've really appreciated your expertise on this important and complex topic. I also want to note before I let everyone leave, due to our technical glitch, the Novartis logo inadvertently was on some of Mark's slides. So it's just worth noting that Novartis and Focus are two separate entities. And so apologies for that error. So we hope everyone will join us next week, August 17th, for our final session of our mini semester. We'll be speaking with two patient advocates and hear about their experience with cell and gene therapies. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barrett.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.